Welcome, ACPS families. Before we get started this evening, we would like our interpreters to offer instructions to families on how to access simultaneous interpretation in Amharic, Arabic, and Spanish. We will start with instructions in Amharic.
እንኳን ደህና መጣችሁ የACPS ፋሚሊ። አሁን እንግዲህ ከመጀመሪያችን በፊት ቋንቋዎችን የትርጉም ቋንቋ እንሰራጣለን በአማርኛ፣ በአረብኛና በስፓኒሽ.
And we will follow that with instructions in Arabic.
مساء الخير، نرحب بكم بهذه الاجتماع، وهذه الجلسة هي مترجمة باللغة العربية والإسبانيولية والأثيوبية.
And finally, we will provide instructions in Spanish.
Gracias por mantenerse en sintonía. Vamos a proveer interpretación simultánea en español. Por favor, presione el globo que está en la parte de abajo de su computadora, en la pantalla abajo, y seleccione español. Si está viéndolo en un teléfono, por favor presione los 3 puntitos al final de su pantalla y entonces seleccione español. Muchas gracias.
Chair Anderson, I do believe that we are all set and ready to go.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening
አመሰግናለሁ። እንኳን ደህና መጣችሁ
for our first community engagement for the ACPS Identity Project.
El proyecto de identidad de la ACPS.
We're so pleased to have Douglas Reed with us tonight. Mr. Reed is a professor of government and director of the master's program in educational transformation at Georgetown University. He's also the author of Building the Federal School.
مرحب فيكم بهذا الاجتماع.
Also with us this evening is Kennetra Wood, the executive director of alternative programs and equity for ACPS. Please use the Q&A button to submit questions this evening, and I will now turn it over to Mr. Reed.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you all for coming, and I hope everyone is healthy and safe tonight in these challenging times. So tonight, Ms. Wood and I are going to do a bit of a tag team, going back and forth between the past and the present. We're going to tell some stories about Alexandria City Public Schools, and particularly about T.C.Williams, who was superintendent for a very long time here in Alexandria. If you have any questions along the way, please send them to the Q&A box. I want to give some highlights of the talk that I'm going to give and that Ms. Wood is going to give. First, I'm going to talk about T.C.Williams as his background and how he arrived in Alexandria, and tell you a story about Lois Hundley, who worked for ACPS in the 1950s. Next, I want to tell you about Williams's view of Black students and his persistent fight to slow and block segregation. Block desegregation in Alexandria. Ms. Wood is going to sort of connect some of T.C.Williams the man and compare that with T.C.Williams the school and what's the current context there. And I want to talk a little bit about origins of special education in Alexandria and what T.C.Williams did to launch special education in Alexandria. Ms. Wood will connect some of that to current day context of services for students with disabilities. And then I'll have a few more comments about the transition from T.C.Williams to John Albaum, who was the superintendent who followed T.C.Williams. Ms. Wood will then sort of contextualize some of the things that John Albaum did and how they relate to what's going on today in Alexandria City Schools. So T.C.Williams didn't like to be called by his first name, Thomas Chambliss Williams. He also did not like having his photograph taken, according to journalists of the day. He arrived in Alexandria in 1933, and he was superintendent until January 1 of 1963, so nearly 30 years. He had been appointed a young superintendent at age 27 in Chester, Virginia, just south of Richmond. And he arrived in Alexandria when he was 39 years old. He had graduated from Virginia Military Institute in 1915 and served in World War I. He could really be characterized as an establishment man. He's very concerned with efficiency. He's very concerned with middle-of-the-road educational philosophies, and he's very concerned with conserving public resources in a very frugal way. When he arrived in Alexandria, within a month, he proposed building a new high school. That high school became George Washington High School, which opened in 1935. At the same time, he was cutting back on other services, partly due to Depression-era budget pressures. So he was really committed to building schools, and he expanded a lot of schools, but he didn't really do that for African-American students in Alexandria. He was also very confident about the kind of educational philosophy that Alexandria needed. He was very much a back to basics kind of superintendent who was very committed to the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. He didn't want any new theories of education, and he was really satisfied with, well, just fundamentally average education. As he put it, "We have no aspiration to be spectacular." This was a direct quote from him in a profile in 1958 in the Washington Post. His efforts to conserve the past and to not change things and to stick to traditional methods also extended to the preservation of Jim Crow schooling in Alexandria. The maintenance of both black and white schools was central to his understanding of what counted as good schooling. And part of how he did that was, in many instances, got very imperious and very demanding of the folks he worked around. And one incident led to the dismissal of Blois Hundley. Blois Hundley, in 1958, was a cook at Lyles Crouch Elementary School. She'd worked in Alexandria for a while. She joined the lawsuit seeking to desegregate Alexandria schools because she wanted her two daughters, shown here, Pearl and Theodosia, to go to desegregated schools in Alexandria. When Williams found out that one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit worked for Alexandria City Public Schools, he was outraged and he fired her. And he called her participation in the lawsuit a slap in the face. He took the legal fight as a personal insult. He later reversed that decision when the U.S. Department of Justice began investigating Williams for the violation of Blois Hundley's civil rights and offered her job back. She refused and went on to work for a philanthropist in New York who had heard about her dismissal in the New York Times. But the resistance to Blois Hundley's dismissal was just one small part of how Williams fought desegregation in Alexandria. The school board spent tens of thousands of dollars fighting the desegregation court battle. This was long after Brown versus Board of Education, and this was even after the Virginia campaign of massive resistance was struck down in the courts. And it was even after they lost the local battle in 1959. That led to desegregation on February 10th, one day after Arlington's on February 9th. And here we see Catherine, Sandra, and Gerald Turner, who are integrating William Ramsey School. But even after losing all of that, they continued to appeal, but they also continued to develop a plan by which they could minimize the number of students who would desegregate white schools in Alexandria. And T.C.Williams was really the central architect of that plan of delay. They had to, because of court order, use criteria that were not racially biased to evaluate the individual petitions to attend the formerly all-white schools, but they insisted that every student petition the school board if they wanted to leave their all-black school. In those petitions, Williams wrote the responses in conjunction with the school board. And some of the language he uses to deny the enrollment of these children in the previously all-white schools is disturbing and chilling. I'm going to quote some of it, but I have to say it's not pleasant language. One of the rationales that he used for an eight-year-old girl, he stated that while her standing at the black school has been one of leadership and excellence, she will be in the lower reaches of her class at the white school, unrecognized and of no special note. This is not a good change. In regards to a 7th grade boy who petitioned, Williams wrote, he would find it a frustrating and discouraging experience to pass from a position of prestige in one place to a position of low rating in another. It does not appear from the record that this boy has either the ambition or the spirit to enable him to compete successfully with even the lowest of the 7th grade at the white school. Finally, a third example, and I took these almost at random from the book. There are several accounts in this. And this is another, I think, elementary school girl, where he writes, to transfer this girl to the white school only because there are 3 others in the white school as low in competence as she is, only makes a bad situation worse. It does not profit her at all. The grade will be more heavily burdened with additional problem cases. So the whole stance, even after they lost all the court decisions, was to delay and block and thwart. And it worked. T.C.Williams eventually tired, and he retired at age 68, roughly. In that 3-year interval, he only allowed 75 black students to transfer to the formerly all-white schools. That's only 3% of the black student population in Alexandria at the time. So there was only very minimal desegregation, and T.C.Williams was instrumental in that. I want to turn it over now to Ms. Wood to sort of connect some of these accounts of T.C.Williams the man with the current context of T.C.Williams the school.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. And as you shared with us, when we think about who T.C.Williams was and really look into him as a person and as a man, we know that he represented racist beliefs of the Jim Crow era, and was a stark segregationist who used policy to block students' access and opportunity. The quote that Dr. Reed mentioned about "we have no aspiration to be spectacular" is almost a direct opposite on the continuum of where T.C.Williams, the school, is right now. It is a place where the educators are encouraged to be reflective and innovative as we work with all students within our school division. T.C.Williams now represents being on an anti-racist journey. They're committed to social justice and racial equity, and are racially and culturally diverse student population, with about 120 different countries represented and about 121 different languages represented. Students of all cultural backgrounds and from across our globe are represented at T.C.Williams. And there's a direct contrast between who the man was and who the school is and what the school is right now, and what they represent nationally and globally as a world-renowned school.
Great, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about how T.C.Williams' efforts to block desegregation also spills over into other areas of schooling, in particular services for students with disabilities. Right? And that gets us to the origins of special education in Alexandria. And the history of provision of services to students with disabilities is troubled in Alexandria. It originated as a racial containment strategy to limit the exposure of white students to Black students. As T.C.Williams was casting about for strategies to how to limit desegregation, he hit upon this idea of irregular learners, students who were learning below grade level, and the need for a separate kind of education for them in order to not act as a hindrance or an obstacle to the other higher achieving students, which were, in his view, generally always white. A quote from 1960 talks about this as a strategy. Weak pupils have been allowed to enter and to accumulate from year to year. If we can now control the trouble at its source, we will eventually make a profound contribution to the school system. So in order to identify these irregular learners, as they termed it, they applied IQ tests of mental maturity that were racially biased to identify children for these readiness classes. Those students would then be put in a separate readiness school or program. Often those readiness programs were located at the two Jim Crow elementary schools, and sort of replicating, although under an officially non-racial language, the separation of students. But there's some interesting things about how the school district characterized these irregular learners. In the documents that I went through, there was one, this was from the Office of Special Education in the early 1960s, characterized two kinds of irregular learners. There's the familial, according to the school district, although in the document they spelled familial wrong, but I'll leave that where it is. Characterized the familial as the one who learns very slowly always and will not change. So sort of a always persistent underachievement. And then contrast that with a child who's made poor progress even though he has the ability. And so through programs for irregular learners, the school district separated out African-American students from other parts of the school curriculum. But there were a couple of things I want to say before I get to the next part. But that process of identifying, sort of two things came out. One was that not all of those that were identified as irregular learners were Black. So in fact, the numerical majority of those students were white, but Black students were overrepresented. And in many instances, the fact that white children would also be in these irregular learner programs or readiness programs was almost seen as kind of the cost of doing business to maintain a separate higher achieving program for white students. When questions arose about the provision of services that didn't necessarily involve race, T.C.Williams's frugality really comes to the fore. There was one particularly revealing episode in 1962 when 1961, the Alexandria Association of Retarded Children, which was the name the organization had at that time, submitted a letter to Alexandria saying that there were 13 students they were aware of with cognitive disabilities who were receiving zero services from the school, and they asked that the school system do something. And Williams basically was able to make 8 of those students ineligible for services because of a variety of mechanisms: too old, too young, they moved, they didn't make the test time. There were 3 that he said were, quote, were found to be of such nature that they would not profit at all by being included in a trainable class, as they were not judged to be trainable. Their presence would be one of simply being there. Of those 13, he identified 2 that the school system could actually do something for, and he only offered homebound instruction for those 2 students. So this is a really sort of troubling way in which he seeks to shunt outside of the school system students who have significant needs, and really for the purposes of cost saving. In fact, he mentioned in his report to the school board that these programs are, quote, very expensive, and was really trying to minimize the cost of to the school system of educating students that the school system had been ignoring for a long time. This is a pattern that he also employed when he was confronted with evidence that there were a number of deaf students. There was an organization that said there were 150 students who were either deaf or hard of hearing who needed additional speech and hearing assistance in Alexandria. He pulled in an old friend of his, the director of public health in Alexandria, who said, really, there's only 63 of them, cutting that number in half. And in fact, most of them don't need any additional services. They're fine the way they are. So his efforts to sort of make students with disabilities disappear was really an effort to restrict cost and to focus only on one segment of the student population. He also, in the late 1950s, began to pay attention to gifted and talented students, because he saw this as a way of again, tracking white students away from Black students. And he really encourages the development of tracking in the late 1950s, early 60s in the high schools. The full development of a tag program doesn't come along, though, until the mid-1970s under Superintendent John Albaum. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Wood again, who I think is going to talk about some specialized instruction services for today.
So thank you, Dr. Reed. I just want to point out again the beliefs of T.C.Williams, the man, and the belief that not all students are capable of learning and learning at the capacity of those around them, or gaining skills and being able to move forward. When you talked about the irregular learners, and that belief just comes out in some of those statements and the statements that were made around why students weren't able to attend the white schools, why the Black students weren't able to attend. And with specialized instruction and our students who had special needs, it was the same thing. And even though the white students were being treated in the same way if they were special needs, we also see that back then there was an overrepresentation of Black students who fell in those categories as well. And when we look at today, we know in our data and through our specialized instruction audit that we do also have an overrepresentation of Black students in certain specialized instruction categories. But today we've moved from the segregated policies, and we are more of an inclusionary, and we're not looking to exclude students from our classrooms on a daily basis. We are integrated and we are including our students, and that's the important thing, because we have a belief that students can learn and progress can be made regardless of their disability. We also think about the lack of cultural responsiveness of our students in specialized groups, and that belief system that kind of has been ingrained and taught throughout years in history. And sometimes people don't even realize that they carry that implicit bias with them when they're talking about or dealing with or teaching some of our students with special needs. We think about the funding. T.C.Williams as a man was very frugal as a superintendent, and the money was not there, nor was he trying to educate the students at all. But at this place in history, we are definitely and adequate funding for our specialized instruction. And most of that comes from our local and our state funding resources. The federal government also funds a part of that, but it had to be forced. It had to be forced starting in 1965 with the All Handicapped Children Act, and then which in turn turned into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1990. And so when we think about where we were with specialized instruction then and students with special needs and where we've come now, we've come a long way, but we still see some of those underlying beliefs and systems and biases that come into play when we think about the perception of our students and even our students with varied language proficiency. So those are just some things that we have to pay attention to as we move forward. And as a division, we're working to address those needs so that we can have equity for all of our students. I'll pass it on to you, Doug.
Thank you. I just want to connect some bridges between T.C.Williams and later Superintendent John Albaum, who replaced him in 1963. And because it's important, because well, we're in a series of 3 talks here, and one of the talks is going to be about the 1971 kind of Remember the Titans championship season, and that was the creation of John Albaum. So Albaum plays a really important role in the history of Alexandria City Public Schools. But he also inherited a lot of things from T.C.Williams, some of which he changed, but some of which he accepted and continued. And that gets woven into the institution of schooling within Alexandria. So one of the things that Albaum developed and sort of made explicit was some of the early efforts that Williams made on tracking. So tracking became a way for Albaum to reconcile multiple demands within the school system and also to control in some ways the expectations of parents that they would be minimizing their exposure of white parents, that their children exposure to black kids would be minimized, right? So there was still in the 1960s, obviously, a real sense that that desegregation was causing harm and disruption, and so tracking became one way in which Albaum could respond to that. As special education, there was more funding, as Kennetra was talking about, from the federal government. The growth of special education in Alexandria in many ways continued to reflect some of that sort of isolation and containment that under Albaum that had started with T.C.Williams. And this is particularly true when the conflicts of the 1960s begin to play out within the classroom. So as you have students who are increasingly frustrated and angry about the lack of progress on civil rights and begin making demands on school administrators and teachers, or just simply, acting out because they're fed up, that becomes a means by which you sort of treat behavioral issues and sort of insolence. And so special education becomes a channel for the disruptive student who is really sort of not having the kind of experience that schools expect students to have. So special education, again, becomes a holding container rather than a way of bringing out the talents of students, whatever those talents are. Another thing that Albaum really relied on, he didn't really seek to integrate schools, right? So there's a real big difference between desegregation and integration. Williams even fought desegregation. Albaum fought integration. And the way in which Albaum did that was to rely on residential segregation within the community and allowed that to control neighborhood school patterns. So if there was residential segregation within the community, that would be reflected in the schooling of Alexandria. He got into trouble with the federal government, and I'll talk about this in another community read-in later on, when there's acute pressures to change that. But his initial impulse was simply to rely on the, quote, as he put it, normal distribution of people within a community, and that schools would represent that. Another way in which Albaum was also kind of preserving some of the Williams's efforts was he was very attuned to parental complaints about lack of student discipline and the sort of breakdown of order within the schools. Again, this goes back to the 60s, were particularly later on, were very much a time of distress within the nation as a whole, but also within Alexandria. There were multiple episodes of disturbances after community conflicts, whether those were police and youth interactions in one instance, or actually the murder of Robin Gibson in a 7-Eleven, which sparked all kinds of uproar within the Black community. And so Albaum and that gets channeled into the schools. And it's also important to remember that this is a predominantly white teaching force, and that the cultural gap between white teachers and African-American students within Alexandria was big. Part of that happened because when they closed Parker Gray and the two all-Black elementary schools, they also laid off a lot of African-American teachers. So that lack of sort of community continuity led to incredible frustrations between white teachers and Black students. And so those are a lot of the things that Albaum continued or sort of extended on into the early 1970s. And we see that play out in what happens in the creation of a common high school called T.C.Williams, which was the 6-2-2-2 plan, which we'll be talking about next time. But I'm going to pass it over back to Kennetra to sort of wrap it up, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. When we talk about Williams to Albaum and Alexandria then and now, it's important to look at where it is on a parallel basis. So, and during the Jim Crow to desegregation time, there was desegregation through, as Dr. Reed said, neighborhood schools and zoning. And that's how today we still divide our schools. We are divided by our neighborhoods and our zoning of where students go to school. And even though at this time we are not in a segregated system, you still may find that communities tend to live in the same racial and cultural areas. And that is representative within our schools. So when you think about our elementary level, we do have schools where there are overrepresentation of, I shouldn't say overrepresentation, but there are higher numbers of one racial group than another. And what that looked like then and what that looks like now is very similar. And when we get to the secondary level, and we think about that zoning, we don't have some of those same things, but when we look at our middle schools today, we have Hammond that is very diverse, that is representative of multiple languages and multiple cultures and multiple racial backgrounds. And we have GW that's a little less diverse. And so it's things that we see, we notice it every day, and we don't always talk about it, but we're starting to talk about it now as we move through our Equity for All ACPS 2025 plan, with at the heart racial equity, because we are looking to ensure that all of our students are getting exactly what they need in order to be successful. And so again, looking at the Jim Crow to desegregation time period, the perception of educational rigor that desegregation brought from our white families was that there was a decline in rigor, because now Black students are going to be in there and you're going to have to lower the way that you teach in order to meet the needs of those students. And so that was that zero sum. It's like you add this and somebody has to lose something. but that's not the case. If we look at it from a perspective of how do we learn from each other, which is where we can be today, then everyone can prosper from being in that same environment. So that perception is what brought about the tracking that Dr. Reed talked about, the tracking of students through our TAG program. And when we look at that today, and we look at our course segregation through TAG, our honors, our advanced placement at the high school level, in some classrooms, it's very clear who is in what class and what class is represented, whether it's honors or AP, or whether it's one of our standard classes or some of our co-taught inclusion classes and self-contained classes. Those are things that are visibly noticeable. And those are things that we're working on now to be able to move forward from that and have all students have the opportunity that they need, or the opportunities to be in the spaces that best meets their educational needs. And so during the Jim Crow desegregation era, there were also opportunity gaps, right? Opportunity gaps that look like in the form of testing. And so when you think back to the policy that T.C.Williams put into play with the Alexandria School Board at the time, those policies were put in place to exclude Black students from coming into white schools, or predominantly white schools. And those exclusionary measures included testing criteria. And that testing criteria, you know, when you look at what the students at the Black school were getting, were they even getting the same opportunities that the students at the white schools were getting? And so we see some of those gaps now in our testing, in our SOLs of today. Those are groups that we are working to build their capacity so that we're lowering those gaps and moving that needle forward so that all of our students are being successful at their rate and at their pace. When you think about the massive resistance of the Jim Crow to desegregation, it was our white families' resistance to integrating the schools and all of the political power and plays that were put into place in order to do that. Even things like the private school and voucher system programs that parents used at that time to then what they called white flight out of Alexandria City Public Schools and into the private schools or into schools in other areas where they could be in a non-desegregated school. And so the private schools in Alexandria played a big role in the history as well as today. I remember coming to Alexandria about 11 years ago and realizing that there were a lot of students who lived in the city but went to private schools. And, you know, being at Minnie Howard for many years as an administrator, you saw a lot of white parents that were coming in from private schools ready to move their students into the high school setting and coming back to the public school system. And so, you know, those underlining things that have happened over the past and what the perception is of what happens at school, the discipline and the perception of discipline in the past, where you had students who were being treated unfairly. And when integration started and the schools were being desegregated and students were now in there together, there was a perception that discipline had to be taken care of because there was all of these problems and fights between white students and Black students, and Black students fighting for their rights to, you know, be heard and be seen and get the same opportunities, which were being seen as disciplinary issues, which resulted in suspensions and things of that nature. And so when you look at our discipline today and the impact that it has, we still see an overrepresentation of our Black students and students of color being disciplined in more than we do of our white students. And so some of those same concepts and beliefs and systems that were put into place way back then are still things that we see bleeding through our system in 2020 today, and things that as a school division we are well aware of. We speak it, we name it, and that way we are able to do something about it as we move forward and put the things into place so that we can get to a place where we eliminate these gaps and eliminate this disparity and eliminate the racial inequities that we see, so that we can achieve equity for all and achieve racial equity within our division. And it's just interesting as we continue to go, that cultural gap that you talked about, the white parents that complain, we still hear that. We still hear some of those things with tag and my student should be in tag. And so we have to really take a deep look at who we are now and think about where some of those belief systems came from and how it is ingrained into the institution that we call our school system. But again, naming it, putting it in the forefront, recognizing it, and not shying away from it is the only way that we can move forward and have change and make a difference as we continue on this road of being a racially equitable school system.
Thank you, Ms. Reed and Mr. Reed and Ms. Wood. We are, thank you so much for that presentation. We are now just about 17 minutes left, so we are going to handle as many questions as we can during that time. Question number 1 is for Mr. Reed, and it is, were Williams' policies in contrast with the prevailing attitudes in Alexandria from 1935 to 1965?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is he reflected the place, and he was part of a machinery of governance, and that was sort of reflected the values of those who were sort of elites within Alexandria at the time. And he was very well connected to a broader bird machine within Virginia, yeah, so it was part and parcel of what Alexandria stood for at that time.
Great, thanks. Number 2 question also for you. How do you think T.C. Williams was able to maintain his job in the city of Alexandria for 30 years? In other words, what was the makeup of the city council and the presumably appointed school board?
So yes, the school board at that time was entirely appointed by the city council. At that time, it only had 5 members, so it was a smaller board. They were mostly all Southern Democrats. Often there would be one member who was more of a moderate Republican. There were some women that served on the school board as well. He kept his job because he kept expenses low, and he delivered for white families who were represented within the political structure a quality education at a, quote, fair price, right? But that came at the price of very poor education for African Americans in Alexandria.
Great. Number 3, also for you. When the school was originally named T.C. Williams, was this contested at the time? Were there other names seriously considered? And so if, sort of a follow on to that, so if T.C. Williams was so horrible, why was the school named after him in the first place?
So he was involved in the planning of the high school. It was the 3rd high school at the time, in the early 60s. And he announced his retirement sort of just as that construction was underway, not quite finished. My sense in going through the archives was that it was seen as a sort of a thank you kind of acknowledgement of 30 years of service in Alexandria. I think other names, I do recall, actually, I need to go back, as soon as COVID allows us to go back into our office, which I'm not allowed to do right now, I have somewhere a list of the other alternative names that were proposed at the time, or I remember seeing it. So, and I know President Kennedy's name was on that list. There was another astronaut that was on that list. I think there were a couple other military figures, a couple of whom had connections to Alexandria. I think it was named for him in large recognition of that 30 years of service, and also kind of a placeholder for the notion that, you know, kind of memorializing a segregationist way of doing business in Alexandria, and it sort of was a sort of a goodbye gift in some fashion, I should say.
I just want to add that actually we have in the minutes on our website under this area under the Identity Project, we do have the minutes from the meetings where, I think there are 2 meetings where the name was discussed, and it has all the list of people who were put forward by the community, and I think even the numbers of people who were voted, how many votes the ones got. So you might find that there. But I want to go along so that we can keep going and getting as many done as possible. So the next one, also for Mr. Reed, were these horrible ideas part of a broader effort, including other Virginia cities too, or was it Williams' own plan?
Mm-hmm.
So if we can briefly.
So there was a broader, massive resistance that came out of Richmond at that time. That started in roughly 1956, 57, actually 55 to 57. And T.C. Williams was not substantially different than other places in Virginia that had a much more bigger segregationist commitment. He was different from, say, Arlington, which had a more kind of moderate stance. So Northern Virginia has changed dramatically since the late 50s, early 60s. At that time, Alexandria was really part of the old guard in Virginia. Because of its historical ties, and I believe the mayor was the brother-in-law of Senator Byrd. There were long-standing ties to old conservative Virginia. Other parts of Northern Virginia didn't have that. But Prince Edward County, they closed their schools for 5 years rather than desegregate. So it was not that out of the ordinary, but it was more conservative for Northern Virginia.
Thank you. The next question is, what was the school board like during T.C. Williams' tenure? Surely he didn't act in isolation. Were the school board members supportive of everything he did, especially his frugal funding?
They were largely in support of him, yes. There was one vote from one school board member who voted in after the court decision went against them to go ahead with the desegregation plan. He was actually removed from the school board by the city council. So opposition, there was a hardening of views. There were efforts to sort of ask for additional funding. Those really came out more in the 60s as there were more public demands for additional services. As new folks moved into Northern Virginia, and there was a sense that there was public demand for more services, that kind of drives the political calls on T.C. Williams to do more. And my sense was part of his resignation at the end of it was he felt like there were too many things that the schools were being asked to do.
Okay, the next one is for Ms. Wood. If we know that the tag tracking programs were created for the explicit purpose of segregating students, why do we allow those programs to continue?
So a short response would be that old term that, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because the program was being used in that way by groups of people doesn't mean that the programs are bad. We do have students that are talented and gifted. We do have students who are ready to excel at different levels and in different ways. And so we do need to encourage that because we need to meet the needs of our students at all different levels and wherever they fall on the spectrum. But as a school district and as our Equity for All 2025 strategic plan lays out, we are taking a look at all of those things. We've had an audit of our tag programs. And so I know that in our teaching, learning, and leadership department, those discussions are happening on what that looks like and how we're moving forward and ensuring that equity is for all. And so you don't just throw the program out because this is how community members in one way, shape, or form decide to use it, but you look at how we're functioning as a school system and what meets the needs of our students, not what necessarily meets the needs of the people all around our students, but what meets the needs of our students.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for Ms. Wood. Do you have recommendations for how to meaningfully engage members of our ACPS community who use similar language and rationales to perpetuate the same inequities as T.C.Williams worked to establish.
Right. As a community, we have to have these conversations. The conversation that we're having today, where we're talking about the history and how it is infused and a part of our present, is an important conversation to have. And so as you're having those conversations in your respective areas with your friend group or your neighborhood group or wherever it is, that you're open to that dialogue and to be able to call out things that show up today that we know are ingrained from a very ugly racial history of the past. And so in order to move forward, we have to understand the past, recognize it, be able to talk about it, dialogue about it, answer questions, and leave room for people to make mistakes. And so as a community, we have to be open to having those conversations and sharing that dialogue with each other and be willing to give each other grace as we go through a learning process and be on this journey as a community.
Thank you. The next question we have is for Mr. Reed. What is the history of redlining at Alexandria during the time of Albaum?
That's a great question. I don't know specifically about banking practices in Alexandria. The federal guidelines, a lot of redlining practices came from federal guidelines. So those would be similar as throughout the country where redlining took place. And I'm sure redlining took place within Alexandria. The Fair Housing Act abolished or tried to get rid of those that I believe was in the mid 60s, late 60s. So I'm sure it was practiced, and I don't know at what point it ended.
Okay, the next question we have for Mr. Reed. If T.C.Williams, the man, favored segregation, why was a high school named after him?
A lot of the people who named the high school after him probably still favored segregation. That's the straightforward answer.
Yes. And then this is one that it says maybe for Mr. Reed. So if you know something about this, how many private schools emerged in Alexandria immediately after desegregation?
Actually, quite a few. So in the book, I talk about a program that the state of Virginia launched during massive resistance, where students would receive a voucher to attend private schools. And there was a significant growth of private schools. I don't know how many in particular, but there were hundreds of students in Alexandria who took the private school voucher from the state and enrolled their child within the private schools in the Alexandria area. So the growth of private schooling in the late 50s can be traced in part to the provision of that public aid for tuition.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to let you know that the list that I referenced that's on the webpage of the names that were considered in the minutes from the two meetings, they're actually now in the Q&A section, if you want to look there for them. And I think that might be all the questions that we have time for this evening. And so I want to thank our Doug Reed and Kennetra Wood for being the panelists today. It was a fascinating discussion. And so I want to make sure that everybody knows that the next opportunity is October 1st, starting at 7 for the second read-in. And we have other opportunities, both read-ins and other sorts of community chats throughout the month of October. So, and also I was remiss in not introducing Dr. Hutchings at the beginning of the call. So I just wanted to acknowledge him and see if he wanted to say anything.
No, I was enjoying the discussion. So this is a great discussion. I do want to thank Dr. Reed as well as Ms. Wood for facilitating and having this conversation. I think this is a conversation that needs to be had as we talk about trying to ensure that the community is educated on our history. The only way we won't repeat it is by knowing it. the only way we can figure out how to resolve and to change the narrative is by knowing it. And I love the fact that this discussion was very raw and real. And what this tells us is that at a time when Thomas Chambliss Williams, who was the former superintendent, a school is named after him, and everyone knew that he was a segregationist and knew his political views as well as his educational philosophy, and still chose to name him or name our school after him, says a lot about where the city was at that time too, that we were embracing a segregationist mentality and that we were a very divisive city, and we have to own our good, our bad, and our ugly. So I just want to thank Dr. Reed and Ms. Wood for having this very deep discussion, and also Ms. Anderson for facilitating this actual discussion. And I'm looking forward to the read-in part 2.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if I am handing it off to someone else or not.
I just want to say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to get into some of the history of Alexandria. And I really appreciate it.
Yes, I agree. Thank you all for tuning in and listening and giving us the opportunity to speak to you.